Hello, this is Gallifreyan Jedi speaking, and I would like to welcome you to my YouTube channel. And for this month's blog, the month of August, it will be on the topic of Doctor Who Mythology number 2, Gallifrey and the Time Lords. Now, I have been mentioning in the past that I'm doing this series, both the Star Wars Mythology series and also the Doctor Who Mythology series, starting out building a foundation, doing it on topics of the foundation of these mythologies, of these franchises. So this way we can build on them. We can go to other topics and deal with other topics where the foundation, which I have laid, is very fundamental to this topic. And of course, anyone and everyone who's been following Doctor Who knows that the Doctor is a Time Lord from the planet Gallifrey. So what better topic that we start out with, we do early in our Doctor Who Mythology series, on the topic of the planet Gallifrey and the race of the Time Lords. So essentially that will be my topic for this month of August. And I'm going to be splitting it up into three fundamental parts that I think that will cover or give the basis of the topic which I am covering. And the first part is I want to deal with the planet Gallifrey, talk all about the planet Gallifrey itself. The second part will be on Gallifreyan, the race of Gallifreyans, but specifically Gallifreyan society, physiology, and technology. So we'll cover basically that, who the Gallifreyans are, what is their society like, what is their physiology like, what is their technology all about, etc., etc. And the final part will be, excuse me here for a second, will be on the history of the Time Lords. So I'll be giving a brief history of Gallifrey and of the Time Lords and the Gallifreyans, and basically going back to the ancient times, the beginning of Gallifreyan society, or Time Lords, of the Time Lords and the history of Gallifrey, all the way up to the modern period where the Doctor is at. So essentially that's an overview of where I'm going with this blog on this topic. But anyway, let's start out with the first one. Let's talk about the planet Gallifrey, the home planet of the Doctor. Let's talk about that first, the location. Gallifrey is located, okay, let me back up a little bit. We're dealing now with the location where in space and time where Gallifrey is located. So, alright, let's start out with this. Gallifrey is located in the constellation of Kerberos at galactic coordinates 10, 0, 11, 00, 02 from galactic zero center. Those are the coordinates that are given for where Gallifrey is located in the universe. The planet Gallifrey is located in the Milky Way galaxy at approximately 30,000 light years from the planet Earth, and it is located very close to the center of the galaxy, but on the opposite side of the galaxy from where the Earth is. So basically going back, talking about the coordinates, if you watch Doctor Who series, especially the classic series, and it's even mentioned in the new series as well, but the coordinates I just gave you, well, first of all, watching the old series, it's referred to, Gallifrey is referred to as in the constellation of Kerberos. That's the constellation where Gallifrey is from. And you even hear in several Doctor Who stories, the galactic coordinates are given for the location of Gallifrey, which the coordinates I just gave you are the coordinates. But ironically, the planet Gallifrey is located within our own Milky Way galaxy. You would think that we'd be located in some far distant galaxy, almost like where Star Wars, where the Star Wars galaxy, it's a different galaxy other than the Milky Way galaxy. But ironically, Gallifrey is actually located within the Milky Way galaxy. But it's not anywhere close. It's on the other side of our galaxy, at approximately 30,000 light years from the planet Earth. And whereas our Earth is located, our star system is located within the outer distance, or the outer distance of the Milky Way galaxy. the star system where Gallifrey is located is pretty close to the center of the galaxy. Not in the center of the galaxy, but pretty close to the center of the galaxy. So essentially that's where it is located. Gallifrey is also known as a shining world of the seven systems. That's its nickname, the shining world of the seven systems. Now here's where we're going to get into a little detail, and well, anyway, let me go ahead and give this, and then I can talk about the details of Gallifrey. Gallifrey is several times larger and billions of years older than Earth. And I'm going to be comparing this a lot. If you've seen The Man of Steel, of course, with DC Comics, it's kind of hard to pin down one continuity because they have so many continuities that they've erased over each other. It's hard to pin down one continuity. But I like how if you've seen the movie The Man of Steel, I like how Man of Steel have incorporated a lot of the best elements of Kryptonian mythology into that movie. And that's what I'm basing this on, is that there's a lot of similarities. I don't know if it's purposeful who copied off whom or if anybody copied off whom, but there is a lot of similarities that at least I picked up, that I'm interpreting, that are very close and similar between Gallifrey and the planet Krypton. Gallifrey and the planet Krypton have a lot of similarities. Not exactly the same, obviously, but they do have a lot of similarities. And one of the similarities they have, if you've seen the special features, they don't talk about in the movie, The Man of Steel, but if you have the DVD or the Blu-ray, you've seen the special features on the disc, they have a whole feature on Kryptonian mythology. And this is where I'm gleaning this information from. But anyway, let's go back to the Gallifrey. Let's go back to Doctor Who with Gallifrey, since that is our topic. Gallifrey is several times larger than the planet Earth. That's the same with Krypton. Krypton is several times larger than the planet Earth. And also, Gallifrey is billions of years older than the planet Earth. The same thing with Krypton. It's billions of years older than the planet Earth. So if we look at that description, Gallifrey, number one, is much larger. It's like 2 or 3 times larger than the Earth, and it's billions of years older. Now we know from science that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. Figure that the planet Gallifrey is anywhere from 8 to 10 billion years old, maybe closer to 10 billion years old. That's the age of Gallifrey. But let's move on to get some other facts about Gallifrey, the planet Gallifrey. Gallifrey is in a binary star system. The second star seemed to rise in the south in the morning, making the mountains glow. The main star was large and golden red. Gallifrey's systems contained 5 other planets. Among them were the planet Karn, and also the planet Polophory, and an asteroid named Kerberos the Fipster. So those are basically other satellites or other moons or planets in Gallifrey's home star system. So Gallifrey is one of the main habitable planets of that star system. The planet Karn, you should know the planet Karn as that's another habitable planet, but that was seen. The planet Karn was seen in the classic Doctor Who story, The Brain of Morbius, and also if you've seen the 5-minute the short that they had for Day of the Doctor called Night of the Doctor, where the Doctor returns to the planet Karn. That's planet Karn. It's also in the same star system as Gallifrey star system, and there's another one, Polophory. That's probably mentioned in the expanding Doctor Who expanding universe. Don't remember seeing it in either the classic series or the new series, as far as I know of at this point. But also the asteroid named Kerberos the Fipster. Those are just to name a few. But like I said, Gallifrey is known as the shining world of the seven systems. So that kind of gives you a clue at what Gallifrey's star system is like. And like I said, Gallifrey is in a binary star system. A binary star system means 2 stars that are a pair. Just like you see in Tatooine, in Star Wars with Tatooine. Tatooine, is in binary star systems, which ironically astronomers on Earth are discovering that there are plenty of star systems out there with a binary, mean a system of planets with but 2 stars, 2 suns, which is very interesting. But Gallifrey is from a binary star system. And then, like I said, I told you about the 2 suns. The main star, the main sun, the first one, I guess the second star, like I said, seemed to rise in the south in the morning. But the main star, that's the sun, the first star, is large, very large and golden. It's a red giant. Essentially, it's a red giant. That's another similarity to the planet Krypton, because Krypton star system, Krypton star is a red giant. And of course, not to go off on DC mythology or Superman mythology, because this is not the topic for it, but just to give you an overview, that's what gives the Kryptonians their strength, because they have a dense molecular structure. They come from a planet with greater size, the gravity, and of course their bodies have a dense molecular structure, and the red sun nourishes the rays of the red sun nourishes them. So when they come to a planet that's smaller, like Earth, and a sun, a yellow sun, which is our sun's like a mediocre sun. It's not a red giant. It's a mediocre yellow star. The rays of the sun, of yellow sun, give them their power, which Gallifreyans have. But we're not talking about, not Gallifreyans, I mean Kryptonians. Excuse me, I don't want to get those two mixed up. But obviously, it doesn't work the same in Doctor Who mythology. Although Gallifrey is a much larger planet, comes from a binary star system, and its main star is a red giant, just like Krypton's sun is. But they don't have the dense molecular structure, etc., like the Kryptonians have. But the Gallifreyans have their own special superior physiology, which I'm going to get to later in this blog, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. But anyway, that's that. I think I covered pretty much with that, talking about the star system that Gallifrey is from. Gallifrey had at least 2 large moons and a ring system similar to Saturn. One of the moons was a copper-colored Pisisthi Gallifreya, that's the name of the one moon, which shone so brightly it could be seen during the day, which is an interesting thing for their planet. But anyway, moving on. From orbit, Gallifrey looked rust-colored. Now this is important. Listen to this. Okay, let me read this, and I can go on from here. From orbit, Gallifrey looked rust-colored, with brown lakes and gray clouds. On the planet's surface had an orange sky, snow-capped mountains, fields of green grass, and trees with silver leaves. The silver leaves reflected the morning sunlight and made the forest look like it was on fire. Gallifrey also had a green forest, golden fields, and red deserts. Gallifrey was much drier world than Earth was. Now it's interesting that if you're up in space and you're looking at Gallifrey from orbit, it looks like, and they did it pretty well in the classic series, showing you from orbit ships approaching a couple times, ships approaching the planet Gallifrey, and it looked like a planet that was rust-colored with brown lakes and gray clouds, which is as it's described by most as being that way. But if you're on the surface, if you land on Gallifrey, happen to land on the planet Gallifrey, on the planet's surface, it had an orange sky, which is similar both in the classic series and also in the new series, so it's consistent. If you've seen any of the Doctor Who stories where it takes place on the planet Gallifrey, the planet's surface had an orange sky, snow-capped mountains, so obviously high in the mountains was much colder than below, and it had water. Obviously they had enough water because the mountains were covered with snow and ice at the top, at least at the top. But they had fields of green grass and trees of silver leaves. And I liked how it's fascinating. This must have been a sight to see for anybody, Gallifreyans or anybody who would have seen it, or even outsiders, other alien races or human to witness this. For the silver leaves to reflect the morning sunlight and make it look like the entire forest was on fire. That's something we kind of got a hint of in the new series, but not in the classic series, primarily because of technology for special effects. But anyway, moving on, Gallifrey also had a green forest and golden fields. Now, the golden fields and the red deserts is what we saw in the classic series. If you've seen in the Doctor Who story, the 6-part story of Invasion of Time, you see former Time Lords, Gallifreyans, who live out in the golden fields and the red deserts, and that's where Lilo was sent to. If you've seen that story, I don't want to go too much into details of what's happening in that story, but you do see a group of Gallifreyans who were used to be Time Lords, but they decided they renounced Time Lord society and they lived on Gallifrey in the outlands, the outer, what they call the outlands of Gallifrey, which was pretty much desert, golden fields and red deserts. And you did see that in the very clearly in the 6-part story of Invasion of Time. Now, Gallifrey was also much drier than Earth. Because they had water. Obviously, any planet that has a civilization must have some kind of water on it, whether it be water vapor or rivers or ocean or whatever. But needless to say, overall, that Gallifrey was much drier than Earth because it had less water, had less ocean or less rivers or less water on it. But anyway, that's pretty much, I think I've covered the majority of what I can cover for what the planet Gallifrey is all about. The actual planet is all about. Location, the system it's from, the star, the planet from orbit, and the planet, and the planet, if you're standing, you're on the planet, what the surface of the planet looks like. So I pretty much hopefully I covered all my bases with that. But let's move on now to Gallifrey. Who are the Gallifreyans? Gallifreyan society, physiology, and technology. So we're going to talk about who the Gallifreyans are. Let's first describe who are the Gallifreyans without getting ahead of ourselves. Okay, Gallifreyans were a humanoid species native to the planet Gallifrey. The Society of Time Lords arose from this species and considered themselves to be the elite of Gallifreyan society. The Time Lords are the ruling class of the Gallifreyan race, and they are the ones who control and use Gallifreyan technology, specifically their TARDISes. The rest of the Gallifreyans are exactly the same in physiology as the Time Lords, but they are the normal citizens of the planet Gallifrey. So understand that. The Gallifreyans, basically, the race of the Gallifreyans, or the intelligent humanoid species that are native to the planet Gallifrey. Now, we also hear interchangeable words from Gallifreyan to Time Lord. We also hear them referring to the Time Lords as a race. So you question, are the Time Lords a separate race from the Gallifreyans? What are those distinctions? When you say Gallifreyan and Time Lord, what does that mean? Well, essentially it means Time Lords are also Gallifreyan. The Time Lords are also Gallifreyans. So all the humanoid species on the planet Gallifrey are Gallifreyans. But the Time Lords are distinct in the ways because they're the ruling class. So think of, even though the Time Lords are referred to as a race many times in Doctor Who, both in the classic series and also in the new series, technically Time Lord is a society within the Gallifreyans. And they're basically the elite class, the ruling class of the Gallifreyans. But they're all one race. It's just that the Time Lords are a distinct society. And those who don't live in the capital, they live in the capital with the Panopticon. But essentially the Time Lords live in the capital. But those who live on the rest of the planet Gallifrey itself, or Gallifreyans, they have the same physiology. They're the same race, the same being, but they're considered the normal citizens. They're not the ruling elite class of their civilization. And it's usually the Time Lords who own and possess the technology, like TARDISes. The average Gallifreyan doesn't use a TARDIS, but the Time Lords can use a TARDIS. They own the TARDISes and they operate the TARDISes. That's that. Hopefully I've defined for you what a Gallifreyan is and how they are distinct, or what their distinction is, as far as from a Time Lord, because obviously the term Time Lord is also used as a race. It's referred to as a race in the Doctor Who series. Let's talk about the Gallifreyan physiology. What is the physiology of a Gallifreyan? Gallifreyans and Time Lords look exactly like humans from their external appearance. Gallifreyans were extremely tough and resilient, and the average Gallifreyan is superior in resilience than a human in their prime. Gallifreyans have considerably long lifespan, even without their regeneration process. Within one life, they could live for hundreds of years before needing to regenerate. The Gallifreyans had all the sense that humans had, but to a superior degree, whereby they had extraordinary reflexes and precision timing, literally superhuman. Now this is where it gets interesting, because if you remember, like I said, going back, making some illustrations, or making some comparisons between Kryptonian society and Gallifreyan society. Well, like I said, in DC Universe, Kryptonian society, because of the nature of their star system and the planet and their bodies, their physiology, that when they came to a planet like Earth with a yellow sun, they had superpowers. Well, the Gallifreyans didn't have those same powers, even though they come from a star system and a planet that's very similar to Krypton. But still in all, the Gallifreyans, their physiology is superior to that of humans. And I just described it. Now, they look just like Kryptonians. They look exactly like a human being. Time Lords look exactly like a human being from the outside, but they are not human at all. And they're very tough and resilient. And their resilience is far superior to the average human. If you think take an athlete in the prime of his life, anywhere from he's 21 to 30, and he's super healthy, and he exercises, and he's the best at his athletic competition he could possibly, think of somebody like somebody who trains and competes in the Olympics. So you take the best of the human being at his best in his physiology and his resilience. That's still subpar to a Time Lord's physiology. Just by nature, a Time Lord's physiology is so much more resilient and powerful than a human being is. And if you've watched Doctor Who, you would know that, because the Doctor does have a very tough resilience and a very tough physique and power, even though his regenerations, he can look old or younger or thin or whatever. It's not the big muscles of the big guy that's really that makes him strong. It's the physiology of a Time Lord that makes the Doctor very resilient and strong, and superior to that of a human being. And I say superior physiology. We're not talking about superior as far as the essence of a living being. We're only talking about strength and resilience and in the physiology of the biology of the beings between a human being and a Gallifreyan. So keep that in mind, that's how I'm distinguishing it. They have very considerably long lifespans, and most of us know, so figure, well, okay, that's because a Time Lord can regenerate. We've seen the Doctor several times regenerate over the series, right? So that's how come they can live a very long time. But no, just within one lifespan. Keep in mind, the Doctor, William Hartnell's Doctor, he was the first life, shall we say, the first Doctor, or the first life of the Doctor, because when William Hartnell had not regenerated, his Doctor had not regenerated at that point. So by the time he regenerated into Patrick Troughton's Doctor, he was like some 400 and some years old. Keep that in mind. Now by the time we get to Tom Baker, he was 750 years old. And by the time we get to Colin Baker's Doctor, he was like 900 years old. So you can see how the progression of over time, how they age. So within one lifespan, we're talking about before regeneration, a Time Lord would only need to, a Time Lord or a Gallifreyan can live several hundred years before he needs to regenerate. So they do have incredibly long lifespans, and that's discounting their regeneration process. The regeneration process allows them to live an extra several hundred years, and then the next several hundred, so they can live well over 1,000 years. That's a long time. So it's interesting that you can see not only do they have superior strength and resilience, but they also have extremely long lifespan, even just within one lifetime alone before they have to regenerate. They also had the same kind of senses the humans had, but their five senses were superior to a very large degree, and they had superior reflexes and precision of timing. Literally, some could refer to them, Gallifreyans and Time Lords, as literally superhuman in a lot of ways. They had a superior mind, but I'm going to get on to that in a second. I don't want to get ahead of myself. But anyway, that essentially, like when I'm talking about the senses, the five senses, the Doctor could hear things that most human beings couldn't hear. He could see things that most human beings couldn't see naturally, or smell things, and et cetera, because they had superior sense, and their reflexes and precision of timing was also superior to the average human. But anyway, going on from there, let's talk about the Gallifreyan internal anatomy. I think that's very important. Now, I talked about the physiology of a Gallifreyan. Now let's talk about what a Time Lord looks like on the inside of his body. A Gallifreyan had an internal body temperature of 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and they were able to lower their body temperature further before it became fatal. The Gallifreyan brain was much larger and more complex than the human brain, and they had a form of eidetic, if I'm pronouncing that, eidetic memory, whereby they were able to recall every detail, even the most insignificant moments in time. They also had the ability of touch-enabled mental manipulation. Gallifreyan blood was different from human blood, darker, and with a slight orange tinge to it. Gallifreyans had 2 hearts and a binary cardiovascular system, and had 2 pulses which could be detected in the wrist. Gallifreyans also had a respiratory bypass system, which instead of large lungs, they had a series of pulmonary tubes parallel to the lymphatic system. They needed this in order to operate their 2 hearts and be able to conserve oxygen, in which they were also able to breathe less air. And you can see this in Time Lord anatomy and physiology, especially with the Doctor. The Doctor, it's interesting because as humans have, 98 degrees Fahrenheit, that's the body temperature of a human, if I'm getting that right. While Gallifreyan had a much lower body temperature, closer to like 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And they were able to go into colder temperatures, and the body temperature could even lower down further before it became really dangerous to them and even fatal. Whereas you start tinkering just a few degrees below the 98 degrees, a human being, and you're talking about human beings then go into then they go into hypothermic shock, and then they can die from that. Well, Time Lords can lower their body temperature much further below than their normal temperature without getting hypothermia and dying. Of course, they're not invincible. It goes down further enough, then they will get hypothermia and die. So they're not invincible. They're powerful, but they're not invincible. They're mortal. They're still mortal, even though that physiologically they're superior to humans. Gallifreyan brain obviously is much larger than the average human brain. That was the problem that Dr. Solon had in the Brain of Morbius. It's just a 4-part story with Tom Baker, Brain of Morbius, trying to find a body for Morbius's brain, who was a criminal Time Lord himself. And he couldn't use a human body because the human head, all human heads were too small for a Time Lord's brain. So he couldn't use a human for that. But also the Time Lord, the Gallifreyan brain, the Time Lord brain, was way more complex than a human brain. That means they had a powerful mind, very powerful, very highly intelligent. Their intelligence skyrocketed. It would make the intelligence of the Gallifreyan brain would make people like Einstein look like an imbecile, look like somebody who is basically brain dead. That's how far superior the Gallifreyan brain is to a human, that even the most intelligent person, somebody we think of like Einstein, would be inferior to a Gallifreyan's brain. Although you do see a lot of times where the Doctor has met very intelligent scientists and has got even though his intelligence is far superior to theirs, he does enjoy good conversations with people who do show a superior level, a genius level of intelligence. Human beings, of course, I'm referring to. They had like I said, eidetic memory, if I'm pronouncing that right. I do ask for forgiveness if I'm pronouncing that wrong. But they were able to recall, this is the power of their super brain, they were able to recall every detail, every significant moment in time. And they also had this ability to enable mental manipulation. Their brains were so far that they even had, like, the sixth sense. They had the ability to contact other people through their minds, read minds, and have ESP and stuff like that, which I'm going to get to because I'm going to be dealing with Time Lord history. And it's interesting when I read about Gallifreyan history, some of the things that arose during that time. But I'm not going to get too far ahead of myself. I want to cover this information first. But the Time Lord's mind had that ESP. I mean, they can even mentally project their mind. They can move objects with their mind. So their mind was very vastly superior in that they could use that for mental projection. And you can see that they even had mind, which is a lot of times it was fatal to the Time Lords who got involved in this, but they challenged each other a lot of times to a duel to the death through a mind wrestling, what they call mind wrestling. That happened one time with the Doctor and Omega, the essence of Omega inside the black hole. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself because I haven't talked about Omega yet. And also Morbius, when he encountered the resurrection of Morbius on the planet Karn. They had that situation where the Doctor and him and another Time Lord used the touch-enabled mental manipulation. Okay, I've dealt with, we've talked about that the Gallifreyan's blood was different than humans, and that was quite often when in stories where the Doctor was on Earth and they took samples of blood and looked at it under a microscope, they could tell it was different. It was not human blood. The Gallifreyans and Time Lords had two hearts, and they had a binary cardiovascular system. A double cardiovascular system. And they had two pulses for both their hearts. You can be detected on the wrist. Usually when you detect a pulse on the wrist, you're detecting one heart, but you can detect, they have done that with the Doctor too. When they took the Doctor's pulse, they could detect two pulses because of the two hearts in his binary cardiovascular system. And also, one of the big things was with Gallifreyans is they had the respiratory bypass system. And they didn't have lungs like human beings have lungs. They had a series of the pulmonary tubes. And very much like lymphatic system, if I'm pronouncing it. I guess I don't make the best biologist, but anyway, I'm trying to get this right. But their respiratory bypass system was needed because of the two hearts and their binary cardiovascular system. Because of that system, they needed that kind of respiratory bypass system in order to exist and operate. But because of that, they were able to breathe in and conserve a lot of oxygen if they needed it for a long time. Like if they were cut off from an oxygen supply or air supply, they can store it inside themselves. And also, too, they can also breathe very low. And we see this at times when the Doctor is put into situations where they're trying to suffocate him, or the enemies are trying to suffocate him, or he's in an area where there's low oxygen. He can breathe, he can concentrate, mentally breathe down, so he doesn't need that much oxygen or air to operate, or to, that he won't die of suffocation or deprivation. And he can also filter out. He has the ability, his body has the ability, Time Lords and Gallifreyans have the ability to edit out poisonous gas. So if they breathe in gas, they can separate it from the oxygen and have it removed from their body without the gas being harmful to their body. So that respiratory bypass system is it's something that has evolved into Gallifreyans, but it's something that's very useful for both their binary cardiac, their two hearts and their binary cardiac system, binary cardiovascular system, and their two hearts, and also their body as it consumes oxygen, how it operates with basically air and oxygen, how it consumes it. All right, hopefully I've done a sufficient job at explaining what the what Gallifreyan physiology and internal anatomy are all about. But that's basically both the exterior and the interior of a Gallifreyan or a Time Lord. That's what Gallifreyans and Time Lords are all about. That's what they are as far as their being. But I think the last part of this is dealing with Time Lord society, basic Gallifreyan and Time Lord society and their technologies, dealing with Gallifreyan technology. I think that is important to cover. Okay. The Time Lords were said to have control over much of the structure of the universe. They had set up the web of time. The Time Lords were well advanced in mathematics, biology, xenobiology, chemistry, physics, and technology. And their main technology was their space and time travel machines known as TARDISes. A TARDIS implemented the technology of dimensional transcendentalism, which is where they place the inside of a TARDIS in another dimension than where the outside is at. The Gallifreyans also mastered the technology of stellar manipulators, which could speed up the development of stars. When, at one time, they had one star explode, but its development to a black hole had been frozen, they trapped it in a permanent state of decay that was kept either under the Panopticon as the Eye of Harmony to power the civilization of the Time Lords, or in TARDISes to use as their power source. And it's interesting because this really gets the heart of Gallifreyan technology, of Gallifreyan society, when it comes to their advancements. Not only just not just talking about just their physiology superiority, but they prided themselves, especially the Time Lords, prided themselves on science and reason, and specifically also their technological advancements they've made over the millennia. And the chief of them, the top chief of them, is their stellar manipulator and the TARDIS. The stellar manipulator is what gave them the power, and also to be able to manipulate stars to explode so they can study how they develop into black holes, and then be able to harness the energy, which they did. Okay, with one of the stars that they exploded, they froze it before it could become a full black hole, before it could develop into a black hole, shall I say. They froze it in time, and they trapped it in a permanent state, and they put it in the capital, in the Panopticon, in the capital, which is in the capital, as the Eye of Harmony. I'm going to talk about the Eye of Harmony in a second when we get to the history of the Time Lords. But that powered the entire power, that powered the entire civilization of the Time Lords. It gave that whole planet the power that they needed, but also gave the ability to power their TARDISes, giving them the power to time travel in space and time. And they also created the Web of Time. Now keep in mind, I've talked about the Web of Time before in other Doctor Who blogs. But what the Time Lords did is they fixed the structure of the Web of Time, basically, to make sure that other races that were developing time travel and actually time travel did not disrupt the timeline. Because if you disrupt the timeline, if you disrupt the timeline of history, then that can create chaos, from very small chaos to something that's totally universal chaotic, where the whole universe explodes. So in order to prevent that, the Time Lords created the Web of Time, where they protected the universe from paradoxes and time changes to the timeline, and prevented other races from doing much damage to the timeline. So that was known as the Web of Time. They kept structure, keep complete structure to keep stability in space and time. But with their advancements in mathematics and biology and xenobiology and chemistry and physics, technology, they were able to create a technology known as dimensional transcendentalism. And what dimensional transcendentalism is you have an object, and basically on the inside is actually in another dimension. So the space of the inside, being that's in another dimension, can be any size. It could be super large. But when you step out of it, the outside of it looks very small. And that's the way they designed their TARDISes. And for good reason, because you don't want to have a gigantic spaceship landing on every planet and every place in space and time when you travel the universe with your TARDIS. You wanted to have it very small. And plus they developed, which is incidental, this is probably their technology to a lesser degree, they developed the chameleon circuit, which the TARDIS, when it lands on a planet or ship or wherever, the outside of the TARDIS basically turns into something that blends into its background. And that's what happened. Ironically, that's what happened with the First Doctor. The First Doctor, after some time, years after he left Gallifrey with his granddaughter Susan, they came to Earth to hide out on Earth in the 1960s in London, and what am I thinking of? Sort of like a junkyard in London. And the TARDIS automatically, in order to blend it in its background, the chameleon circuit turned the TARDIS into a police box, a 1960s police box. But the TARDIS stayed in that way for many years because they got established on Earth. They stayed there and they lived it. The Doctor just lived in the TARDIS all the time. Susan started to go to school as a high school girl. But needless to say, you know the story where Barbara and Ian and Barbara, who were the school teachers, followed her home one night and discovered the TARDIS. And the Doctor took them off, to show them what the TARDIS is all about. Well, the TARDIS got stuck. The chameleon circuit had broken at that time, between the time that it landed on Earth and the time that Ian and Barbara made their way into the TARDIS. The chameleon circuit broke, and basically from time immemorial, from that time, from the first episode, The Unearthly Child, all the way up to the most recent episode of the new series, we know the TARDIS, or at least the Doctor's TARDIS, as a police box. The police box, which is bigger on the inside. But that's because of the technology of dimensional transcendentalism. I gave them that time. And of course the TARDIS can travel anywhere in the universe, anywhere in space and time, forward or backward. And I dealt with that in my first Doctor Who Mythology series on the theories on time travel, so I'm not going to go into any of that. You have to watch that, look about the nature of time travel in the Doctor Who universe. And, I'll let you watch that, so I don't want to go off on that. But, But anyway, that's basically that is covering overall. I mean, keep in mind, the Gallifreyans, by the time we get to the modern era of Gallifrey and also Earth, the Time Lords were supposed to have been the most advanced, the most prominent, the most advanced civilization in the universe. Technology, their technology was supposed to be far superior to any other race in the universe. This is what the Gallifreyans boasted on, especially the Time Lords. The Time Lords boasted that their technology was the most advanced, and technically it was, because nobody else had a TARDIS, where they had, nobody else had mastered the technology of dimensional transcendentalism. And it's interesting because if you've seen the story, the Robots of Death, the beginning, the 4-part story of Robots of Death with Tom Baker, the beginning of that story, when Leela and the Doctor are in the TARDIS, Leela is in the TARDIS for the first time, and she can't figure out why it's bigger, so much bigger on the inside than on the outside. Now keep in mind, Leela comes from a savage tribe, not a technologically advanced tribe, so the Doctor has to explain to her things on a very simplistic level. So he gets a small box, he grabs a little small square box and a big square box, and he says, which one is bigger? And she points to the bigger one, and he places the bigger one down on the console of the TARDIS. Then he takes the smaller box and brings it up closer to her eye, and he goes, which one is bigger? And she says, well, it looks like, because you're holding it so close, it looks like the smaller one is the bigger. And it says, exactly, that's what dimensional transcendentalism is. That's what Time Lord technology is all about, the Doctor explains to Leela. But he says, what he ends up saying is, now imagine this. Imagine, obviously the box I'm holding too close to your eyes is the smaller one, and the one that's on the console is the bigger one. But it looks to you, because I have it so close to your eye, looks like the smaller one's bigger than the bigger one. Now imagine if you could have that perspective. The smaller one is bigger than the bigger one, and at the same time being able to move the bigger one inside of the smaller one. So essentially that's how he explained what dimensional transcendentalism was to Leela. I mean, it's a very simplistic level. I think the Doctor did it a lot better than I did. So watch that episode if you want to hear that explanation played over again, maybe more simpler than I explained it, if you're confused by my explanation. But anyway, moving on, I think it's important now that we move on to the history of the Gallifreyans, the history of the Time Lords. This is the creme de la creme of our study. What is the history of the planet Gallifrey and of Gallifreyans and the Time Lords? How did the Time Lords come about? Well, we're going to answer that right now. Okay, Gallifrey was the home planet of the Time Lords, which had a rich, long, storied history. The history of the Time Lords reached back for billions of years, and the Gallifreyan civilization existed in the distant past from the dawn of time. They are the first humanoid species to have evolved in the known universe. And interesting enough, like I said, Gallifrey is billions of years older. Obviously, Earth is 4.5 billion years old, while Gallifrey is closer to 10 billion years old. So, humans have been around for a little over, say, 1 million years. The Gallifreyans have been around maybe for 5 billion years. Quite a significant distance of time for the existence. Remember, in the first episode, Unearthly Child, the Doctor explains to Ian and Barbara that they come from a civilization where they were at the they were at the golden age of their civilization with technology, shall we say, long before human beings were on the Earth, or longer than even the Earth existed. And there's plenty of times they explain it. So Gallifreyans are much older; they're billions of years older than humans, and they're actually the first humanoid species to have evolved in the known universe. And what I mean by humanoid is beings as defined in Doctor Who, beings as defined that look human. There was an episode in the new series, basically the 11th Doctor, Matt Smith, his first season he was the Doctor. They did an episode called The Beast Below, where Amy Pond finds out from the Doctor's confession that he's not human. And she says, "You look human." And the Doctor turns around to her and says, "No, you look Time Lord. We came first." And I love that statement. That's probably one of the most famous statements of the new series, because it's true. That's essentially what we're looking at here, is that the Gallifreyans don't look human. The humanity on Earth looks like Gallifreyans, because Gallifreyans were the first humanoid race to have been created and to have evolved in the universe. They're the oldest race in the universe. I mean, oldest race as far as human races. There's other alien races out there that go pretty close back to where the Gallifreyans were, but they didn't look humanoid. They looked alien. Just like in Star Wars, you have the human races and the near-human races, which I won't get into. You'll have to watch my previous Star Wars mythology blog on that, what the differences between in Star Wars mythology, what humanity is in species that are near human. But you have that, but you also have aliens in Star Wars universe, which look alien. They're not human, and they don't look anything like human. Well, the same thing in Doctor Who. That you have alien races, the ancient ones, that go back pretty close to the Time Lords, and but they're alien races. They don't look human. But Gallifreyans and Time Lords, they do look human. But they're the first. They're the first humanoid race to come into the universe. Hopefully I didn't overdo that, or hopefully understand what I'm talking about there. But anyway, let's go back to Gallifreyan's prehistoric past. Gallifreyan's prehistoric past, from the time before the Gallifreyan race came about, a lizard-like creature inhabited and ruled the planet, which later became extinct. So, sounds very similar in some ways to our own history. Before humanity came about, 65 million years ago, dinosaurs ruled the planet. Then they became extinct, and then human beings came about. Well, there was some type of reptilian or lizard-like creature that inhabited ancient Gallifrey, prehistoric Gallifrey. And they ruled the planet, and that thing ruled the planet for millions of years or whatever, but it later became extinct. But this is before the Gallifreyan race came about. They didn't exist at this time. This was the prehistoric time of Gallifrey. But anyway, moving on. Okay. Now we're going to get into the time where the Gallifreyans do exist. They have arisen. That lizard creature is now dead. Now comes the Gallifreyan race into existence. They develop a civilization, a very primitive civilization. But now we're going to go talk about their time of their written history, the time that they started recording their own history. And the first period in their history was known as the Dark Times. The Dark Times of Gallifrey was also known as the Old Times, or the Age of the Pythias. Okay. Now there's two periods in the Dark Times. Now keep in mind, this is the Gallifreyan race. This is the Gallifreyan race, and it is before the time of the Time Lord Society. Time Lords didn't exist back then. They were Gallifreyans, yes, but the Time Lords Society did not exist back then. Like I said, the Dark Times were known as the Old Times, or the Age of the Pythias, which I'm about to explain in a second. But this was before the time of the Time Lords. And there was two periods under the Dark Times. The first one was the time of the Empires, and the second one was the time of chaos. So let's start out with the history. Let's start out with the history of the time of the Empires. The first era of this time was known as the time of Empires. During this time, the Gallifreyans were known as the Shadow People, as they were a society caught between darkness of magic and light of science, as magic dominated Gallifreyan culture for a long time. At this time, Gallifreyans fought many wars with the Old Ones, ancient beings from another universe that were godlike. Now, this is going to be very important as we move further through this time period. But like I said, the Gallifreyan race was first known as the Shadow People because this was an age they called Dark Times, almost like how we view our Middle Ages. It's because they were dominated by magic. They were dominated by a lot of religious wars and magic. And although that there were people who studied science, science was not a predominant predominant principle of study on Gallifrey at this time, in the ancient times. It was pretty much darkness, and magic dominated Gallifreyan culture for literally centuries. And Gallifreyans fought these wars with the old ones. Now keep in mind, the old ones, if you're familiar with the Black Guardian, the White Guardian, they're an example of old ones. Basically, they're almost like ascended beings that come from another universe, but that can also come into our universe, appear in our universe. And many of them had fought. Now, some of them were worshipped as gods by the Gallifreyans. But other ones, the Gallifreyans went to war against many of them. They had many different names. A very typical one that the Gallifreyans referred to as the Old Ones. But they were beings from another universe, and they almost appeared godlike. But the Gallifreyans were at war with them, ironically. But at this time, the Gallifreyans developed an empire. Now, moving on, the Gallifreyans' early empire was very huge, where they had colonies all over the galaxy, and slave trading was very common, but protested by many of the other Gallifreyans. Now, this is another similar thing to Kryptonian. If you've seen The Man of Steel, this is very similar. In The Man of Steel, it was explained that several millennia ago, prior to the early 21st century was on Earth, or the modern times was, the Kryptonians had an exploratory period where they explored the galaxy, they explored the universe, and they colonized various planets, set up various colonies all over the galaxy. Well, very similar. That's the time. In the ancient times, they actually had space exploration. The ancient Gallifreyans had space exploration as they created an empire. And through this empire, they set up colonies on various planets throughout the galaxy. Sister colonies to the Gallifreyans all over the galaxy. Keep in mind, it was still a barbaric period, so they had slave trading. Now, like any society, just like our society had back prior to the Civil War, there was protest against slavery, abolitionists. Well, amongst Gallifreyan society, it was a minority, but there were abolitionist Gallifreyans who were against slave trading and spoke out strongly against it. But anyway, I think that's pretty much sets it up with that. Moving on, at this time, Gallifrey was ruled by the Pythia. Now, this is interesting. Pythia is very important because that was what this age was known about, as the age of Pythians, or Pythias. Okay, so at this time, Gallifrey was ruled by the Pythia, who were a line of female seers who were the ruling class of Gallifrey, and whom divined the future. They perpetuated mysticism and were against science and reason, and they developed telepathy, where it became problematic for the Gallifreyans to keep their own personality and secrets. Many Gallifreyans worshipped the Menti Celesti, which were made up of a group of Eternals, pain, death, and time. That's what these Eternals were known as, pain, death, and time, which were seen as the deities by the ancient Gallifreyans. From this, they created religious orders of priests, monks, and wardens, and they all had a high place in Gallifreyan society until the rise of the Time Lords. Now, just to go back, the Pythia was an order of Gallifreyan women, female seers, but Gallifreyan women, and they were the ruling class of Gallifrey. And so, but essentially, they delved into mysticism. They divined the future. They delved deep into mysticism, but at the same time, they suppressed science and reason. Now, keep in mind, there were still many Gallifreyans in its ancient history that still studied science and believed in reason, but they were in the minority, and they were oppressed by the Pythia because the Pythia were the ones who ruled Gallifrey. They were the ruling class. And I would assume that would mean the sister colonies too, somewhat of the sister colonies. Of course, that's unknown. I don't know how much of the sister colonies followed the Pythia. The Gallifreyans, who settled in colonies on different various planets throughout the galaxy. I don't know how much they were aligned with the Pythia. But on Gallifrey, the Pythia were the ruling class at this time. And they perpetuated mysticism, in which they oppressed anyone who followed science, studied science, and followed reason. And they were strong in telepathy. Like, remember what I said? That the Gallifreyan brain is huge and complex, and they had like the sixth sense, and they had mental powers, the mental touch powers. Well, these Pythia women, these Gallifreyan women known as the Pythia, they developed these mental powers of telepathy. And so but because of that, it became very problematic. It's almost like having the internet today for the Gallifreyans. It was almost like their worst nightmare, just like how our technology is becoming our worst nightmare about, privacy. We have trouble with issues of privacy in our society. Can we actually be private, have a private life? And do we have rights to privacy? Well, those same problems arose, but not through technology, but through their mysticism and telepathy. They had issues that they raised about keeping their own personal secrets and having their own private lives. Do they have a right to it? Can they have a private life? Well, those things all became problematic for Gallifreyans at the time when the Pythia developed those powers. And it's interesting because, like I said, remember I said that the Gallifreyans were at war with some of the old ones, the ancient ones from another universe that were godlike? Well, the Menta Celesti was one of the ancient ones. They were the old ones from another universe. They were a group of Eternals. 3 of them: pain, death, and then time. And they were made up the Menta Celesti. But they were the old ones, the ancient ones from another universe that I spoke about, known as the Eternals, which were ascendant beings from another universe. But these group, the Menta Celesti, instead of at war, the Gallifreyans were at war with them. They actually worshipped them as gods. The Pythia were, because of their mysticism, became very religious and worshipped the Menta Celesti. And from that, they create religious orders of priests and monks and wardens that served the Menta Celesti. And they were the highest, because if you were in one of these orders, a priest, a monk, or a warden, within the religious orders of the Pythia, then you were at the high chain. You were at the top chain of society, of Gallifreyan society, because they were that caste system, a very class system in those ancient days. And even in the modern times somewhat, but more so in the ancient times of Gallifrey, they had a class system. And the caste system, but their class system, the highest ones that were regarded were the priests and the monks and the wardens and the other religious orders that worshipped the Menta Celesti. They had the highest place in Gallifreyan society. That was until the rise of the Time Lords, and that all changed, which I'm about to get to in a little bit. Moving on, it was at this time that early research into time travel was being performed, and the first time machine, known as Time Skyphay, was powered cyclically rather than technologically. So it's interesting, even in that ancient period, the dark times of the Age of the Empires, not only did they have space travel, space exploration, and colonization of other planets, but they were actually making their first attempt at studying time travel, building very primitive, very quaint, primitive time machines known as these time Skyphays. But they were actually trying to, for the first time, the Gallifreyans were trying to practice time travel. The Pythia ordered this, and it was under their order, under their rules, and under their civilization that they built these little primitive time machines that they were time traveling. But the difference is that instead of powered by technology, energy and technology, it's powered psychically. So again, that super powerful brain that Gallifreyans had, they were able to use that psychic energy, that mental pushing energy, to actually run. That was the energy they used to run these time scaphaes, and used it to time travel. Very primitive. I don't know how far and how much time travel was done in that period, but that was the first rudimentary exploration into time travel that the Gallifreyans actually were involved in. But anyway, I think it's important that I move on from that. Hopefully, I covered enough information, because that was the time of the empires. That was at the height when the Pythia ruled over Gallifrey. That was the height of their empire. They had these religious orders. They had some of the old ones, the ancient ones from the other universe. They fought with wars, and some of the other ones, like the Mental Celesti, they worshipped as gods. They practiced space travel and space exploration and colonization into other planets, and then they even did the rudimentary exploration and research into time travel. So that was at the height of the age or the time of the empires, or the time of the Pythia. That was the height of their empire. Now we're going on to what we call the time of chaos, which is the decline of the Pythia Empire, the time of the Gallifreyan Empire under the Pythia. The Pythia were in decline in this period. Anyway, let me go on. This is the time of chaos. During this time, the power of Pythia declined in Gallifreyan society. It was the early days of Rassilon who became the founder of Time Lord Society, as he led a group of neo-technologists in their rise to power on Gallifrey. The last Pythia who was to lose her precognitive abilities. Then she cursed Gallifrey before committing suicide. The remaining members of the Pythian Order left Gallifrey and went to the planet Karn, where they eventually became known as the Sisterhood of Karn. So interesting enough, during this time, the Pythia were in decline. Their power, their influence over Gallifreyan society was declining. And a lot of this mainly had to do with Rassilon and others who were like him. I mean, Rassilon was the primary individual who led this revolution, who led this intellectual and scientific revolution. But he wasn't the only one. But he was primarily the founder, the main one, who did the most in leading this revolution of neo-technologists. And of course, I'm assuming that there was a conflict between the maintenance or the maintaining of the order of Pythia with their religious orders and their mysticism, and then Rassilon leading his followers of neo-technologists into a battle of intellect, a battle of wills over the ancient power, the ancient form of mysticism that was the foundation of the Pythia society that was ruling there since the ancient times. And the new ideas that came under Rassilon and his followers, the neo-technologist followers, and they fought each other over, a battle of wills. Who was it going to be? The old ways of mysticism and the religious orders which worship these deities from another universe, or was it going to be science and reason? Was that going to be the new thing that was going to rule over Gallifreyan society? And but needless to say, because of that battle was going on in their society, the Pythia declined. Their influence declined in Gallifreyan society. And because of that, the Pythia started to lose their powers, a lot of their mystical powers, such as precog, to be able to tell the future, predict the future. They lost that. So when the last Pythia, the last female Gallifreyan, Last Pythia, when she lost her cognitive ability, she was the last one the last of the ones to lose the abilities. That means there were Pythia still around, but they didn't have the power, the influence over Gallifreyan society, nor did they have their psychic abilities anymore. So when the last one who had those powers lost it, she ended up cursing, trying to cursing Gallifrey, and then she committed suicide. Reasons for that I don't know, but she took her own life for whatever reason. I don't know if it was because she felt it was part of the curse, or was it because depression and disillusionment. She didn't want to live anymore. I don't know. But we know that she committed suicide. But there was still Pythian. There were still several Pythian, but they had lost all their influence and power they had over Gallifrey since the earliest part of the age of the time of the Empires era and the Dark Times. So the last remaining members of the Pythian order, they left the planet Gallifrey. Now keep in mind I said that there's a few other planets in that Gallifrey star system that could sustain life. So they went to the planet Karn, which could sustain life, and they settled there. And they continued their old ways, even though that they had their ancestry was from Gallifrey, and they were Gallifreyans from their ancestry. They were and their descendants became known as the Sisterhood of Karn. Like I said, if you've seen the 4-part story with Tom Baker or Brandon Morbius, and also they did that little mini episode prior to the Day of the Doctor called The Night of the Doctor, when the Doctor returns to the planet Karn and he returns to the Sisterhood of Karn. Well, the Sisterhood of Karn some people, I know that some people who have seen Doctor Who that knew nothing about Doctor Who saw the Sisterhood of Karn and they said they look like witches. Well, I guess in a way they would appear as witches for us here on Earth. But they were an order of women. Their ancestry came from the Pythia, the Gallifreyan Pythians. But they had renounced the Society of Gallifrey and came to the planet Karn, and their descendants became the Sisterhood of Karn. And so the Sisterhood of Karn kept the old ways of Pythia. They practiced the mysticism and mental telepathy. They developed because their brains, because their ancestries, they are related to the Gallifreyans. They have a lot of the Gallifreyans' physiology and mental powers like the Gallifreyans have, such as larger brains, the mental telepathy, the mental psychic powers, the mental pushing, and they're able to actually see things precognitive, being able to see things psychically precog, and also being able to move things through time. They move the TARDIS and they move the Doctor at one point in the brain of Morbius through their mental abilities. So you can see a lot of the Sisterhood of Karn still practices a lot of the same things that the ancient Pythia did. Is the Sisterhood of Karn, which is in modern times of Gallifrey, they practice what the ancient Pythia used to practice in the ancient times of Gallifrey, the Dark Times of Gallifrey. But anyway, that's what became of the Pythia, the remains of the Pythia. They became the Sisterhood of Karn, which they developed a Sisterhood of Women. And like I said, they would resemble somewhat witches because of their mystical practices and stuff like that. But only women can be in it, into this group, and they were the descendants of the Gallifreyan Pythians. But anyway, that's what the Sisterhood of Karn became. That's what happened to the Pythia, the last remnants of the Pythia, and that's what they evolved into, is the Sisterhood of Karn. But anyway, moving on. After the collapse of the Pythia, war and chaos arose and threatened the Gallifreyan Empire. An ice age began on Gallifrey, as well as the Gallifreyan colonies started to demand their autonomy. Okay, so now we see that the Pythia have lost their power and influence. Not only their political power over Gallifrey, but they had lost all their psychic and mystical powers as well. And we see that when the last one lost her power and committed suicide, the remaining ones left Gallifrey and went to Karn. So now the Pythia are out of the picture. And Rassilon and the Time Lords, this is still prior to the Time Lords gaining power. Rassilon and the Time Lords were still in the early stages prior to their revolution, their scientific and rational revolution over Gallifreyan society, over the planet Gallifrey. So keep that in mind. But because of that, we're in this in-between period, chaos all of a sudden, war and chaos, civil war and chaos arises on the planet Gallifrey, but also amongst the Gallifreyan colonies all over the galaxy. Of course, there's civil war because people are trying to obtain power and gain power. But also, and two, speaking of a natural disaster, an ice age actually at that point began on Gallifrey, which didn't help matters. But also, too, at the same time, the Gallifreyan colonies on other planets, the Gallifreyans on other colonies, remember, they still had, even though that they were colonies, they still had to maintain their they still had to maintain their patronage to the planet Gallifrey, to the Gallifreyan society, which was at that time, going back centuries, was ruled under the Pythia. But now the Pythia are gone, and then there's a civil war trying to vie for power over Gallifrey. It was at that time that the colonies wanted autonomy. They wanted independence, just like America wanted independence back in the late 18th century. And we fought that war for independence. Well, the Gallifreyan colonies and all these different planets, they decided, okay, the Pythia are out of there. This is a new age dawning. We want our independence. We want our autonomy from Gallifrey. So that became a problem for the Gallifreyans at the time. One more thing. I think I've explained that enough, hopefully. One more thing to mention from this time. This is also out of the time of chaos. A living metal known as Validium came into use on Gallifrey. So they discovered a living metal known as Validium that they put to use. So we see that science is progressing more in this time period, even though that they're in a period of chaos and civil wars and colonies trying to fight for independence and autonomy. Science and reason was starting to grow because the Pythia no longer had their influence and power over Gallifrey. So they made certain discoveries, such as this living metal known as Validium, and they started to use it, and they started to make advances in their technology and advances in their understanding of science and research, which is interesting with that. But now we're moving out of the time of the dark. We're moving out of the time of the dark times, We're moving out of the times of the dark times. Middle Age history, or the Middle Times, are still still in the ancient times of Gallifrey. But we're moving from that dark time into the early days of the Time Lords. Now, keep in mind, you remember what I said. The Pythia were gone. They had civil wars trying to vie for power, and also colonies trying to vie for independence and autonomy. But we also had many of the neo-technologists. What we had is the rise of science and reason starting to permeate Gallifreyan society. And that started to rise in the powers of the Rose. And from that, we see the dawn of the Time Lords. The age of the Time Lords now has begun. So let's deal now with the early days of the Time Lords. During this period, the Time Lords arose to power with history of their two founders, who were the technologically polymath Rassilon and the stellar engineer Omega. Now remember, I mentioned Omega before, and I have been talking about Rassilon. But Omega, keep in mind, when you think of Gallifreyan society, when you think of Gallifrey and the Time Lords, think that the Time Lords had two founders. The Time Lords, as we know them in Doctor Who series, both the classic series and also the new series, it had two founders in their ancient history, and that was Rassilon and Omega. Now there was others, who were very prominent in helping the Time Lords evolve into the society they have become. But the two main founders that you want to think about is Rassilon and Omega. Okay, Rassilon was the social engineer, both politically and technologically. He was the engineer for Time Lord Society. And the solar engineer was Omega. He was a pure scientist. Omega was a Gallifreyan scientist, but who majored in stellar engineering, solar engineering, and physics. Astrophysics. He was essentially, Omega was their astrophysicist in particular. But anyway, let's deal with that. The Age of Rassilon. Let's deal with the Age of Rassilon, because, like I said, the early days of the Time Lords. The first part, like I said, Rassilon and Omega were the founders of Time Lord Society. So let's deal with the Age of Rassilon. During this time, Rassilon instituted changes in order to deal with the problems with the Gallifreyan Empire. He established the great houses to stabilize society. So that's the first thing he did, is a social revolution and social engineering to bring the chaos under control. The civil wars, the infighting, the fighting for liberation, for independence and autonomy amongst the Gallifreyan colonies and all these various planets throughout the galaxy. And also the political and social upheaval and the wars and the conflicts. That was the first thing that Rassilon tackled, that he had to deal with. And in so doing, he established, now there's probably a lot more that goes into this, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to basically refer to. You can probably do more research into this, but you can do, but I'm just going to refer to as his establishment of the great houses, which was the thing that stabilized the society. So that was the first thing he did, is he was able to stabilize Gallifrey society from civil wars, from conflicts, from infighting, to a place, a civilization that was now stabilized, that was now at peace, and it was now willing to accept the future, the revolutionary future of science and reason, and so therefore he could establish a new form of government over Gallifrey and a new society. This was what Gallifrey was going to become as we know it today. But moving on, the Time Lords were the first race in the universe to begin research into black holes. At this time, Omega used two stellar manipulators, known as the Hands of Omega, quote, Hands of Omega, unquote, whereby he detonated a star known as Quaba that created the black hole from which the Time Lords were able to draw power from, that gave them the ability to time travel. Omega accidentally fell into a black hole, into an antimatter universe, and was presumed to be dead. Rassilon eventually retrieved the Eye of Harmony and stored it in a vault beneath the Time Lord capital as a source of power. So both Rassilon and Omega, in their studies of astrophysics, black holes became a significant interest to them. And Omega, being the solar engineer, the Gallifreyan solar engineer, he created these stellar manipulators. And of course, they were nicknamed the Hands of Omega. And what those stellar manipulators did, is it advanced because keep in mind, a star can take 10 billion years. Our star alone, our star is mediocre. It's a yellow mediocre star. It's been around for 5 billion years. It's predicted by scientists to be around for another 5 billion years before it goes supernova and wipes out our entire star system. So that's 10 billion years, and that's for an average mediocre yellow star. But there are many other stars that are much bigger, like the red giants and stuff like that. Maybe they can exist longer. So you've got these stars, which most stars can exist for billions upon billions of years. So what Omega's stellar manipulator did is it was able to accelerate the life cycle of a star until it either exploded or went supernova, and then they could study it. Well, one of the stars that they explored and did this experiment on, the star Quaba, star Quaba, that was the name of the star that they exploded, which they got their energy from, this was the final one that gave them the technology they needed to create time travel in their power source for their TARDISes. Okay, they were able to detonate the star known as Quaba, and as it was accelerating, being created into a black hole, Omega was able to freeze that in time and harness the energy. Place it. Harness the energy from that, place it in time, freeze it in time, and basically harness it, bring it down to Gallifrey, in which Rassilon used the Eye of Harmony. He retrieved a device known as the Eye of Harmony, and he stored that power, the power of the black hole, from that exploding star of Quaba. He put that frozen black hole into the Eye of Harmony to store it inside the Eye of Harmony, and then he placed the Eye of Harmony in the Panopticon, which is the capital of the Time Lord capital, and that eventually became the source power, the main source power for the entire planet of Gallifrey and for the Gallifreyan society, and it also became the primary source of energy needed to create their TARDISes, and also for time travel, so they could time travel throughout the universe, in time, in time and space. But there was a unfortunate accident. In doing that, Omega fell into the black hole. I'm not quite sure how that happened, but Omega fell into the he accidentally fell into that black hole, and inside that black hole is an antimatter universe. And when that happened, it was presumed by all Time Lords, including Rassilon, that Omega was dead. They gave him up for dead. Now that bit them in the rear end, because if you've seen the Three Doctors and also the Omega Factor with Peter Davison, he comes back. He is not dead. His body is wiped out, but the essence of his mind is still alive inside that antimatter universe. So Omega still, in essence, is still alive. But I won't go into that. That's for another study. So they gave him up for dead. But in Omega's sacrifice, his accidental sacrifice, shall I say, it gave them the power so they could create their Time Lord society and create their TARDISes and all their technology for space and time travel. But anyway, moving on. It was during this time that the Time Lords started to influence other worlds throughout the galaxy. Again, which I'm going to talk about. In Star Trek, they have the Prime Directive, non-interference. Well, there was a time before Starfleet, shall I say not before Starfleet, but before the Federation was formed. They didn't have this code of ethics, and they interfered with other planets and saw the disastrous results. Well, the Time Lords, in sort of recapitulation, the Time Lords had their own period. At this time that they were advancing, after they developed their TARDISes, in the early days of developing TARDISes, and they're being able to explore the universe and explore time and travel the galaxy and travel the universe in their TARDISes, and they encountered other alien races, and they started to influence other alien races with their ethics and their politics and their technology, offering technology to these other planets, not realizing ultimately what harm that would come to them in the future. But we're going to talk about that in a minute. But let me move on from that. In the early days of Rassilon, he was more brutal and warlike, along with all the other Time Lords. And he invented his own blood sport game called the Game of Rassilon, whereby the Time Lords invented the Death Zone on Gallifrey, and used a time scoop that kidnapped various beings from various space and time in the universe. They were placed in the death zone so they could fight to the death. The only exceptions were the Daleks and Cybermen, for they played the death zone game too well, and the Time Lords felt that they would ultimately become a threat to them, so they never used the Daleks or the Cybermen. Now keep in mind, like I said, in the early days, this is still going back to the early days of Rassilon and the Time Lords. They didn't have any fear with interfering and influencing other alien races and cultures, as well as they were extremely brutal and warlike. They were more brutal and warlike compared to what they eventually evolved into. Well, Rassilon developed his own game called the Game of Rassilon. He built the Death Zone. Story that I referenced for you to go to learn more about the Death Zone on Gallifrey is the Five Doctors. You need to watch the 20th anniversary story, The Five Doctors. Well, actually not. It's during Peter Davison's era, but it has all the Five Doctors in it, which they deal with the Death Zone in Gallifrey. But Rassilon in the ancient times, in his early days, created the Death Zone, a place on. It was a dome, a sectioned out place on Gallifrey, on the fields of Gallifrey. A dome was placed on it, and it was called the Death Zone because they would use this time scoop, and they would kidnap various beings from all over the universe, from various planets, space, time, wherever. And they would place them in the Death Zone so they can fight to the death. And it was sort of like the Gallifreyan version of the gladiator fights, the Roman gladiator fights. And it was very brutal and very warlike and barbaric. But see, Rassilon and the Time Lords were that way at that time period. Now, they didn't use, they never used Daleks or Cybermen because they learned very early. They played the game too well. And they were always afraid that the Daleks and Cybermen would be able to overwhelm them and be able to steal their technology and conquer the Time Lords. So they never used them. Now, they did use them in the Five Doctors, but that was, well, I don't want to give that away. I don't want to give the story. If I tell you why the Daleks and Cybermen were inside the Death Zone, that would sort of give it away for anyone who hasn't seen the Five Doctors. But anyway, they in the ancient times they never used the Daleks or Cybermen for that very reason I gave. Okay, moving on. Okay, Rassilon then invented the Matrix, which was a supercomputer, a micro-universe used by the High Council of the Time Lords as a storage knowledge to predict future events. Now, what the Matrix is, now it's interesting we talk about the Matrix because they call it the Matrix, but when the Doctor Who writers referred to the Matrix decades ago, it was long before the movie The Matrix with Keanu Reeves. But it's the same principle. If you've seen the movie The Matrix, the Time Lord Matrix works exactly the same way. And what it does is that when a Time Lord has reached his last, he's reached, because they're only allotted 12, all Time Lords are allotted 12 regenerations, 13 lives. So after they either reach the end of their 13th life, the end of their life, that's when they die naturally, just like human beings die of natural causes. They will die of natural causes at that point. But before they die of natural causes, in order to store their history of their mind, all their experiences, all their knowledge, they will download their entire mind into this computer. And that stores all the memory, all the brain cells, whatever. It stores all the memory and all the experiences of that particular Time Lord. And so if you do that over the centuries, then really you lose nothing. When a Time Lord dies of natural causes, you lose nothing of what that Time Lord learned or experienced throughout his life. And then over the centuries, over the millennia, when you have thousands of Time Lords who've died and whose mind's been stored inside the Matrix, then you have a collection of information, a storage that you can control off of. But that's what the Matrix was. The Time Lord Matrix, and that was an invention by Rassilon. Anyway, let's move on. This is a very important period of history. At this time, the Time Lords accidentally released the great vampires from their dimension into the known universe. Back when Rassilon first tried to harness the power of a black hole, in which they caused mass chaos, these vampires caused mass chaos and destruction as they consumed entire planets and their thirst for blood. Rassilon led the Time Lords into a long and bloody war against the great vampires, in which most of them were defeated with the exception of the King Vampire, whom escaped into E-space. Now, what had happened is these great vampires, or I'm speaking about the great ones, the large ones, the vampires that were super large. They weren't the humanoid vampires that you think of. The humanoid vampires, like you think of Dracula and stuff like that, or have you seen the 4-part Tom Baker story, State of Decay? You have humanoid vampires, but they were once humans that were turned into vampires. Well, we're talking about the original, the Great King and his race. They looked alien, they were large, they looked alien, they were winged vampires. Well, they came from another universe, another dimension. And back before the time of Omega, there was a time when Rassilon first, this is before the time Omega and Rassilon worked together. Rassilon was trying to, in his experiments with science and astrophysics, he tried his first attempt before Omega developed before the time that Omega developed his stellar manipulators. Rassilon had first tried to penetrate and open up a black hole, create a black hole and open it up. And doing that, it opened the doorway to the dimension, or to the universe, that these great vampires were from. They were released into our universe. And probably stayed hidden they became very well known to the Time Lords and to the Gallifreyans for centuries, or for a couple centuries, or whatever afterwards, because it wasn't until this time, I mean, we're talking about after the time of Omega and the stellar manipulators and the power of the black hole to create their TARDISes and time travel and stuff like that. The time, the warlike games with the Death Zone wasn't in that time, but afterwards, after this time, these vampires became revealed to the Time Lords, to Rassilon, the Time Lords, and to the other Gallifreyans as existing, because they wrought mass chaos and destruction. Because they were so big and they needed so much blood, they can go to an entire planet, a populated planet, and drain the blood just to consume what they needed to consume. They could drain the blood of every single inhabitant of that planet. And also, as much as they wanted to choose, they can turn those inhabitants into vampires. That's believed. That's what happened with Earth. That the vampires that came up through mythology in human history on Earth throughout the Middle Ages were a result of vampires being turned by the great vampires. Humans being turned into vampires by the great vampires. The giant vampires, shall we say, the great vampires. And that happened to not only on Earth, but it happened to thousands of other planets throughout the galaxy. So the Time Lords knew that they were responsible for releasing these great vampires into the universe. But since they were responsible, and knowing the chaos that they were causing, they went to war. This is known as the Time Lord Vampire War. And they were able to destroy all of them eventually, because they used these boat ships, like almost like arrow kind of ships that were metal, and they were used just like what you use for Dracula, stake through the heart. They were using that as their own astro stakes, shall we say, powerful stakes. And they found, because they couldn't be destroyed. The Time Lords had a very hard time destroying these great vampires, but when they discovered these kind of arrow-shaped ships, these boat ships, they were able to pierce their hearts of the great vampires and destroy them. So they used that to eventually get the edge on the great vampires and their war against them. And they destroyed all the great vampires, except for one, the king vampire. He was the lead vampire. And he took with him, which I talk about in my video on my top 10 favorite Doctor Who stories. You know, the story of State of Decay, where the Doctor, the fourth Doctor, shall I say, Tom Baker, encounters these vampires in E-space, because this great vampire takes 3 of his followers, 3 humans, which he turned into vampires themselves, and they escaped into E-space, escaping from the Time Lords. But the Time Lords were known to the vampires. Any vampire that was alive existed at that time. From then on, the Time Lords were known as the great enemies of the vampires, and for obvious reasons. But anyway, I mean, I'll probably sometime in the future, one of these Doctor Who mythologies, I'll probably cover some more details about the great vampires, but hopefully I covered enough information just to relate to that, what their history was with the Time Lords. Hopefully I've done enough to cover sufficient enough history with the Time Lords. But anyway, moving on. Following the Time Lord Vampire War, the Time Lords became more civilized and less warlike, as the same with Rassilon. But they continued to involve themselves with other races throughout the universe. So, essentially, something happened during the Great War, the war between the Time Lord Vampire War, that humbled the Time Lords. And then at that time, they started to become less warlike and more peaceful, as the same with Rassilon. But they were still involved, unfortunately they were still involved in interfering with other civilizations and other races throughout the universe. And this is going to have dire consequences, which I'm about to explain in a second. Let's move on. Then the Time Lords encountered a humanoid race known as the Minyans on the planet Minyas, where the Minyans regarded the Time Lords as gods. In return, the Time Lords gave the Minyans technology in order to help their civilization advance. Because the Minyans did not have the cultural maturity to possess and use Time Lord technology, they used it irresponsibly, and as a result they kicked the Time Lords off Minyas, and ended up in a civil war in which nuclear war broke out, which nearly caused the entire Minyan race to become extinct. They almost became extinct, shall I say. So, now keep in mind, some of these lessons, these hard lessons, were going to be felt elsewhere, in other planets and other civilizations that they were interfering with. But it was Minyas, with the race of Minyans, that had the greatest impact on the Time Lords, and it was a single event that caused them to create their non-interference policy. Because, they came to him. It's almost like, that joke which Dr. McCoy says in one of the episodes of a classic Star Trek series. He says, I like to come down here and say I'm the Archangel Gabriel, and kind of jokes that way about civilization. Is because, when you have an advanced technological civilization, and they visit a very primitive, especially one that's steeped in mysticism, very primitive, steeped in mysticism, not very advanced in science and technology and knowledge and stuff like that, they could very easily come off as gods. They're mortal just like you and I, but they can easily come off appearing as gods. Well, these Minyans at the time on the planet Minyas were very primitive. They were humanoid. They looked human just like humanity on Earth is, but they were very primitive at the time. But they admired at first when the Time Lords made first contact with them. They admired the Time Lords, and they saw them as gods, and they started to worship them as gods. The Time Lords thought that they could help improve their civilization, and they interfered with their society, with their politics and their laws, but most of all, they gave them technology, hoping that would advance their civilization. But But when you give a primitive civilization advanced technology before they have the maturity, before they've had the time to evolve as a society and as a civilization, evolve and mature as a civilization, it's very dangerous. You give very powerful technology, as we will see, as we're seeing here with the Minyans civilization, the Minyans civilization. Because they didn't have the culture maturity, or the time to evolve and mature, to possess and use a Time Lord technology. So naturally, they used it irresponsibly. First thing they did, because the Time Lords were trying to interfere, saying, you can't do this, you can't use it for destructive purpose, our technology for destructive purpose. The first thing the Minyans did is kick the Time Lords off Minyas. So the Time Lords said, fine. You want to be on your own, you want to destroy yourselves, go ahead. And they left. The Time Lords left Minyas. Well, what happened was after they left, they ended up in a civil war. Two nation states which warred against each other. Nuclear war broke out. The horrible, unthinkable. Excuse me, I apologize for that. The horrible, unthinkable act of nuclear war broke out. Destroyed their entire planet. Almost, it didn't, but it almost destroyed their entire race, the entire Minyan race. And they almost went extinct, which a nuclear war on one planet where civilization is at, a nuclear war would do that. Now, I probably will do a vlog in the future on the Minyans, but that is, I just basically wanted to cover the basic history of Minyans and the race of Minyans in relation to the Time Lords. What was their history, and how did their history affect the Time Lords to create their non-interference policy? But anyway, let's move on. The Time Lords were horrified at the catastrophic events that resulted from their interference in other civilizations. And from that time forward, the Time Lords adopted a strict policy of non-interference. Rassilon wrote down the principles of non-interference, which eventually became the absolute law of Time Lord society, whereby they adopted a strict policy that they would only observe the events of the universe, but never become personally involved. The non-interference policy became the highest law of Time Lord society, and violating that law resulted in the harshest forms of capital punishment. Now keep in mind, like I said before, not only did they involve themselves and interfere with the Minyans, but they did it to thousands of other civilizations throughout the universe. And there was catastrophic result. Now, what happened on Minyas was probably the greatest, because the Time Lords saw that they gave this Minyans civilization their technology, instead of using it to advance their civilization in peace, they used it for war, to divide over for the society to divide over politics and use powerful technological for weapons of war, which was what the Time Lords were against. And they saw the horrific thing of almost causing genocide and extinction to an entire race of people. And from that, they recognized that they had to immediately stop interfering with other civilizations. It was no matter what resolve they did it for, no matter what reason or how good of a reason that they had, or what their pure motivations were, it always had destructive results. So Rassilon wrote down these principles for non-interference. But his principles that he wrote down was voted by the Time Lords and became the absolute. They become the absolute law. It was their version, just like in Star Trek, you have the Prime Directive. This was their Prime Directive. Rassilon wrote down these principles, then the Time Lord High Council voted them as absolute law, and that became the Prime Directive for Time Lord society. The non-interference with time, non-interference with other civilizations in the universe. What they've adopted, the policy which they've adopted, is that they would only observe the events of the universe, but they never became personally involved. And this non-interference policy became such a high law and such an atrocious criminal act to commit, that they, for the violators, they gave out the harshest form of capital punishment. I'm not talking about just simple life in prison or execution. We're talking about things where they deatomize your entire body, or they go back in time and erase your history, or something like that. I mean, they have some incredible ways and some horrible punishments because they consider the crime of involving yourself into other affairs of other civilizations and other times. They consider that the highest crime that you can commit in Time Lord society. So they dish out the harshest punishments that one can possibly imagine for their Time Lord criminals, their Time Lord violators of that. But anyway, moving on, legend has it that despite Rassilon's great achievements, the Time Lords rebelled against him and imprisoned him in the Dark Tower. In the Death Zone. But what we know is that late in the Dark Times, we're talking about at the end of Rassilon's life, Rassilon had reached his 12th and final regeneration, his 13th life he was in, and he died of natural causes. His body was placed in a tomb, and that tomb was placed in the Dark Tower in the Death Zone. Again, you will have to watch the 5 Doctors to see that, because the Dark Tower is at the center of the Death Zone on Gallifrey, where the remains of Rassilon's body is laid in a tomb. That was the end of his life. But by the time of his death, Gallifreyan society had been fully established. What we know of the Time Lords today, the Time Lord society had been established and evolved into the society of Time Lords as we know them today. The Society of the Lords of Time as we know them today. That's what they had become by the time of Rassilon's death, at the end of his 13th life, his 12th regeneration. Anyway, moving on. As several millennia passes, we come closer to the modern period of Gallifrey, where the dark times have passed and other modern civilizations arose in the universe, including human civilization on the planet Earth. But due to their non-interference policy, the Time Lords had become isolated from the rest of the universe, which induced a complacency among Time Lord civilization. And as a result, their society atrophied, and their power and technology stagnated, which made other races become more powerful and cunning, making them dangerous to the Time Lords. Okay, so in a way, the Time Lords, because of what they saw, what they did to the Minyans and other civilizations, they created this non-interference policy, and that became their prime directive, their highest law in Time Lord society. But that caused them, even though that was a good thing, they were so strict in their policy that they became total isolationists from the rest of the universe. And that had its negative effects because their society atrophied. I mean, they didn't really make advances in their philosophy and science and technology and study of the universe. They watched it, and they continued on the traditions and the studies and the knowledge which they already had, but they didn't make any advancements from that. And their technology suffered as well because that stagnated. And as a result, other races, speaking more like Dalek, more enemy, aggressive, warlike races, Daleks, Cybermen, the Centaurans, they grew in power. And they wanted to challenge the Time Lords, and they got to a point where they actually had the ability. Maybe some of their technology was still behind, but they had the ability to actually have the gall to want to try to challenge the Time Lords. And that became very dangerous for the Time Lords under that situation. But anyway, moving on. This is the last part I'm getting to. It was at this time, during the modern period of Gallifrey, that the Doctor was born, where he was raised on the planet Gallifrey and then went to the Time Lord Academy, and that's where he became a Time Lord. That's where he was ordained as a Time Lord, because he went to the Time Lord Academy and studied to become a Time Lord. Then at the middle age of his first life, when I say middle age, that means that before he regenerated for the first time, his first life, which was William Hartnell, which we saw in William Hartnell in the classic series. The Doctor became very disillusioned. Now, this happened before the time of Unearthly Child, the story of the Unearthly Child, the first story, the Doctor Who story. It came out in 1963. So then, at the middle age within his first life, the Doctor became disillusioned with the Time Lords' strict policy of isolationism. And then he renounced the Society of Time Lords, and he stole a Type 40 TARDIS to explore the universe. We all know that story. Now, the Type 40, keep in mind, I emphasize this Type 40 TARDIS because that was an outdated model for the TARDIS. By that time, I mean, we're talking about, like, think of computers. Think of having a Windows XP or something like that, or having an older computer. That's sort of like what the Type 40 TARDIS was. It was an outdated TARDIS, just like you have outdated computers. It was outdated TARDIS compared to what they were using during their modern period. As a matter of fact, what we see in the Deadly Assassin, the 4-part Tom Baker story, is they said that they retired all the Type 40 TARDISes. So the Doctor's stolen one was the only one that was actually in use, because all the others, all the other Type 40 TARDISes, they had retired. They mothballed them all. And the Doctor only had the Type 40 TARDIS. But of course, being an outdated one, it had its problems. Needless to say, it had its little technological problems. One of which we saw, is when he landed on Earth and a chameleon circuit changed it into a police box. Then the chameleon circuit somewhere between that time broke, and it got stuck as the police box. And when the Doctor first left Earth, after all those many years, with Ian and Barbara and Susan, noticed that, hey, the TARDIS was still the police box no matter where it went. And that's how we recognize now universally, as all Whovians do, is that police box is, we associate that with the TARDIS, because the Doctor's TARDIS got stuck like that. But that was because of the kinks in a Type 40. It was outmoded, and so it gave those little problems, just like an outdated computer will give you problems after time. Kinks, after all sorts of kinks and all sorts of problems that start giving you problems trying to run it. Well, same with the Doctor's TARDIS. But anyway, that's where the Doctor's story starts. I don't want to go any further with that, because now we're coming up to the modern age of Gallifrey. We're coming up to the modern age of Gallifrey, where the Doctor's story begins. And keep in mind, there's a lot of evidence that the modern age of Gallifrey is in Earth's future. And I'm not going to deal with the Time War now, the Gallifreyan time, the last great Time War with the Daleks, the Time Lords versus the Daleks, because that will be for a future blog. But I'm leaving it off here where the Doctor's story begins. Because if you have a good understanding of the Time Lords, then you can begin at an Unearthly Child, the first story with William Hartnell. Work your way all the way through the 25 years of the classic Doctor Who series, from Unearthly Child with William Hartnell all the way up to Sylvester McCoy, his last story, which is the last story evades me. I should know it, but I don't. And then also watch all the episodes in the new series. You should have that basic foundation, but that is the foundation. I've taken you all the way from ancient history of Gallifrey, all the way up to the modern period where the Doctor is born. He renounces the Society of Time Lords. He steals a Type 40 TARDIS. Off he goes. And that's where the Doctor Who series, or the classic series, begins and continues on to the new series. Well, that being said, I think it's time that I end this blog. I'm hoping I did a sufficient job at explaining what the planet Gallifrey is all about, who are the Gallifreyans and what they're all about, and to share what Time Lord history was, from the ancient time all the way up through their modern age, and how that happened. Hopefully I did a sufficient job at doing that. But anyway, I wanted to thank you for watching my video. I very much appreciate it. And if you like my video and like what you saw, I ask you to please subscribe to my channel so you get all the latest updates. And for my next video, and like I said, I alternate each time. My next video is going to be a Star Wars Mythology blog. So it will be Star Wars Mythology number 3, and it'll be on the topic of the Galactic Republic. That should be interesting. So anyway, I wanted to bid everyone a good day, and may the Force be with you.